Hello, ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to today's webinar, which is brought to you by Shared Services Link in partnership with Pagero today. Today, we're going to be running an e-invoicing compliance camp, and our wonderful presenters from Pagero are going to be running you through the 8 essentials that US multinationals really must be fully aware of when looking to do e-invoicing or invoicing in a compliant fashion. So great to have you with us today. Thank you for making the time. And let me introduce our presenters. My name is Susie West. I'm the founder and CEO at Shared Services Link. I'm your host for today, and I'm delighted to be introducing Eric Mood, who is Managing Director North America at Pagero, and Brad Coley, Director of Sales at Pagero as well. You have come here to ask your questions, I should think, and to extract as much information from the next 50 minutes or so as possible. So please utilize this session as much as you can, and really do make sure that you ask your question to both Brad and Eric. Post that through to me, and I will put your question to Brad and Eric in the last 10 minutes of this session. We will email you a copy of the slides directly after the webinar, so you have a copy to refer back to when making some key decisions. And of course, if you want to listen to the audio, that will be available on our website. Do spread the word. If you like our webinars, tell your teams and your peers about them. So why are we having this session today? I mean, it's happening. We can't get away from it. E-invoicing is either a live project or a planned project for nearly every organization out there. It's now being driven at a governmental level. So if it was something that we were maybe thinking of delaying in the past, even though the commercials made sense, we don't really have the option to delay any longer. So why is this? It's largely being driven by the €500 billion VAT gap that exists globally. And the countries that have already deployed the mandating of e-invoicing within their own regions are seeing huge success when it comes to closing the VAT gap within their own jurisdictions. Other countries are seeing this, they're watching it as a proof of concept, and they're realizing it makes complete sense for them to also apply these models that have been road tested in some key geographies now since 2006, 2008. So the business case for many organizations, it's been there, it's existed, but now it really is governments who are driving the pace of change on a macro basis now, on a macro scale. So if you are a multinational, you will be wholly aware that some key territories within your remit are mandating e-invoicing. So this webinar today, we will be examining the context. We'll be looking at some of the considerations, and for you to chew over. We'll then be jumping into the 8 essentials that you really do need to be made aware of, and then some really valuable next steps to help you move forward as a result of spending time on this webinar today. So let's have a look at a couple of poll questions before I hand over to our presenters. First one coming up now. If you could participate in this for me, please. What is your current approach to e-invoicing compliance today? So is it a manual invoice exchange, automated invoice exchange, multiple local vendors that you use? Do you use one global vendor, or maybe other? And if you're kind of doing things in a non-compliant way, or you're not quite ready, or it's very much paper today, maybe you should be ticking the other. To just repeat the question, what is your current approach to global e-invoice compliance? Please select all that apply. So closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's have a look at the results coming up on the screen now. So the winner there is just shy of 60% automated invoice exchange, followed at 41% by manual invoice exchange. Okay, thank you for that. Let's have a look at the second poll question coming up on your screen now. So which geographical areas are of kind of current and upcoming interest as far as e-invoice compliance requirements are concerned? So which geographical area of current or upcoming e-invoice compliance requirements or are of interest to you, would you say? Again, select all that apply. Would you say it's LATAM, the EU, Europe, Asia Pacific, or other? So again, closing the poll in 3, 2, 1, just north of 60% of people responding there. So thank you for that. And probably not a complete surprise that EU/Europe seems to be the winner there with 72%, followed in second place at 44% LATAM. So interesting. Thank you. Let's now hand over to Brad. Over to you, please.
Thank you so much, Susie, and thank you to the Shared Services Link team for this opportunity. As Susie said, my name is Brad Coley. I am the Director of Sales for Pagero Inc. And as has been stated, we are here for an invoice compliance camp to discuss the 8 essentials U.S. multinationals must know. Joining me for today is the Managing Director for Pagero Inc., Eric Mood. Eric, would you like to say hello very quickly?
Absolutely. Thank you, Brad. So my name is Eric Mood. I'm the Managing Director for Pagero here in the US. Been with the organization for the better part of 12 years. So to echo what Brad said, I really appreciate your time and the opportunity to dig a little bit deeper into the world of compliance and to present what US multinationals must know to stay ahead of the curve on this topic. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. And absolutely, thanks to everybody for joining us here today for this session. So what we want to go through today is we first want to address the problem. Anytime that we're looking out in the world and trying to figure out what we want to do, the first thing we need to do is define the problem. So we're going to spend about the next 10 or so minutes talking about what we see as the problem in the marketplace that most US multinationals are trying to define and really understand. Then we'll jump into what are the 8 essentials that the US multinationals must know. As US organizations, we are not always adept and fully in the weeds and understanding of what is happening around the world. So as we walk through the problem, we want to really understand how to address that problem, how you as a US multinational can ultimately understand what is occurring so that you can fix what is going on with your organization and really address what is happening within the marketplace. So we will walk through 8 definitive essentials that you must know. And as any time when you define a problem and you really start to come up with a solution, you got to make sure you understand what are the next steps. How do I get out of the gates? And here at Pagero, we wanted to make sure that we give you some practical next steps to follow after this webinar. What are some of the very first things that you can do as an organization, as a US multinational, to really kick off addressing what is happening to your organization when it comes to invoice compliance around the world? So what we want to do is, again, we want to start with the definition of the problem. And to sum this up really into just one sentence, we live in a world of differences. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric Mood to really illustrate this in a bit of a story. So Eric, over to you.
Thank you, Brad. And that's right. So let's dig a little bit deeper into what this can look like. So let's start by introducing Stephen. And Stephen, he has done a fairly good job in setting up his ERP and supporting systems, making sure that everything is connected internally. The financial system is connected with the CRM, the logistics system is integrated with the warehouse system, and so on and so forth. So Stephen and his organization is pretty happy. So now let's introduce Karen on the other side, which is one of Stephen's trading partner. It could be a customer, it could be a vendor, right, of Stephen. And she has done a similar job on her side, and her systems are connected as well. But when it comes to the communication between Karen and Stephen, everything is still very manual and analog. So invoices and POs are still being sent and received, manually via paper or PDF, and then entered into the system in a manual fashion. And this works for Stephen if you only had one Karen to work with, right? But Stephen, he works for a US multinational, and his organization, they're operational in 26 countries in over 4 continents. And he has thousands and thousands of Karens to communicate with. And what he's hearing from his organization around the world is that some countries, there are government platforms that we need to be connected to in order to send and receive invoices in this example. He's hearing from his colleagues down in Latin America that all invoices must be cleared and approved by various tax authorities before we can either send an invoice or even pay an invoice. He's hearing from his subsidiaries in Europe that PEPL is a new thing that we need to be connected to. And he's also getting countless of integration requests from his business to satisfy the need of his customers and his vendors. So, I mean, Stephen, he's trying to push everything towards email because that is what he understands. And on top of this, the collection department is on to Stephen, and because they want the ability to, report on the progress, calculate DSO, and providing information back on where the invoices resides in the process. He's getting different type of archiving requirements that are very country specific. And in some parts of the world, Stephen is also getting requests about digital signature. He needs to digitally sign a document, whatever that means, right? And finally, Stephen is also tasked with setting up an error handling process should the information be incomplete, and also getting that feedback back to him if something is missing, either based on country specific requirements or customer specific requirements. So this is obviously a mess for Stephen, right? And I mean, as you can understand, this is not a small task. And I'm sure that some of you guys feel like a Stephen sometimes, and if not, maybe you have a Stephen within your organization that do need help. But you are not alone. This is a very common problem for US multinationals.
Great, thanks, Eric. And so really, as we start to hone in on the definition of the problem, let's try and categorize everything that Stephen and really the Karens of the world are dealing with, right? And one of the first things that we need to understand are, what does the regulatory environment look like? In this worldview, as you can see, there are a few markets in which there are no regulation, but there's the emergence of regulation in where these mandates have a minimal impact to perhaps your organization or other global organizations in US multinationals. And then there are, of course, those that have a high impact. And why is that happening? It's important to understand the why as we look at the problem. And the reason is at the top. It is that it is based solely on the VAT gap. That has been the biggest driver for governments to ultimately start to roll out these mandates for organizations to essentially issue electronic invoices so that the government can understand what is happening within their borders. One prime example of this, most notably and recently, is in Italy. And what Italy has done is that they've actually been able to migrate over 97% of the invoices that are being exchanged within the Italian borders over to an e-invoicing system. What has that ultimately done? It has allowed them to reduce their tax gap by 2 billion euro. And that's just after the first year. So really, as we look at what Italy has done, and that is based upon what's been happening around the world prior to Italy, and really the why that we're uncovering here and these VAT gaps that these countries are trying to solve, there's no secret that when you overlay the markets with the largest VAT gaps, you're going to find the markets that are implementing e-invoice compliance, right? So as we look at what's happened over the past 4 years around the world, just from 2019 to now in 2022, we're seeing a trend. We're seeing an exponential growth in the governments that are starting to roll out mandates for electronic invoicing. And even as you look at this graphic, and you may have seen something similar to this before, you will actually notice that there are some country flags there. I wasn't great in geography when I was in school, but I do know some of these flags now that I've been at this for 9 or 10 years, and you're seeing some repetition there. That's not us just trying to build this up and make it look bigger. It's actually changes in legislation or new legislation that is introduced in these individual markets, even once they have already started out. So as you can see here, there is an exponential growth in e-invoicing regulation that is occurring around the world. What does that do for you as an organization? Well, it means that the automation that you've put in place, the processes that you've put in place are starting to break. because ultimately, going back to Stephen, and let's say in this case, Stephen is the seller. He's the one sending the invoice. Well, now Stephen, as he's sending that invoice out the door, as Eric had highlighted, he has to ensure that the invoice is valid. And in other words, it has all the information that is required. He wants to make sure that he's able to get the invoice out the door and into the government platform and recognize, as Eric said, is there an error or is there even a transmission error? Did my invoice make its way through cyberspace to get over into this electronic platform? Then ultimately, as we start talking about terminology like clearance and other things, there is an element of governments rejecting the invoice for certain reasons, or even customers rejecting the invoice. That's on the seller side. I know here in the audience, there's probably some buyers. There's some folks over on the AP side. And so when we look at Karen, Karen also has to evaluate how to pick up the invoice. I'm going to go through some models in just a few minutes, so this may make a little more sense, but within the invoice receipt, Karen has to make sure that she's able to receive all of those. And that could be because it's electronic in one country, maybe PDF and email in another, and she's got to understand how to bring these things in. Does she, as a buyer, accept or reject those? And she would also need to validate those. There are some markets in which she has to check that invoice validity against what the government database says. Then, of course, we start to introduce cross-border. Not everything is just domestic. So there's invoices coming from all over the place. So at every step along the way, you may see that the invoices are either coming back to you as a Stephen and you have to rework that. I have seen customers, for example, that have taken up to 7 days just to get an invoice out the door. Or as a Karen, you got to understand, do I reject that and send it back? Or does it ultimately come into my system? So there's a lot of areas and a lot of places in which this process and the automation that you as an organization are trying to put into place get broken. And when that process breaks, you start to lose visibility. You start to lose control over the data. And hopefully some of these graphics that are on the screen are something that maybe you're already getting from your ERP system or other BI tools in which you're evaluating as a buyer, what is my spend? What is my spend by supplier? What is my cash flow? Where are my suppliers? And in order to get that information accurately and efficiently, you need to have the data in your system. So as you start to break automation and all of these things along the way, have this back and forth flow, you do start to lose visibility and control. So these are some of the issues that we are seeing within the US multinationals that I've been working with for many years. And then on top of these, we see organizations having to ask questions about security and sustainability. So thinking back to the story that Eric just told with Stephen and Karen, trying to bucket these or categorize these are kind of the top levels of things that we see from organizations and the problems that they're looking to address. So with that said, let's take a look at not only what is happening today, similar to what we just showed, but what's potentially going to happen in the future. So as we define the problem, we can't just think about it into today. We need to think about what this is going to look like into the future, and it's going to continue to grow. It's going to continue to be something that needs to be addressed. And you as a US multinational have to figure out from the headquarters here in the United States, how to wrap your heads around what is happening in your individual business units around the world. That may not have been something that you were needing to look at back in 2019 or prior, but as we carry into 2023 and 2024, this is definitely something that you need to address because there is a lack of standardization. Not all of these governments and countries do this the same way. So Eric, over to you. Talk a little bit more about the lack of standardization.
That's right. So I think what's interesting is to look at our everyday life, right? And that looks quite different from what we do at work. So if we when we leave the office today and we go home and we sit down in our couch or sofa, and we've never been more connected. Just by using your phone, you can log on to Amazon, you can buy anything you want, you can do banking inquiries, you can text anyone at any time, and you can call your friends and family regardless of where they are in the world. So in our everyday life, we are very digital, we are very global, we're smart, and we are open. But when looking at this from a work perspective, it's not the same, right? things are a little bit different, and we are far from as connected at work as we are in our everyday life. And we believe by using the right tools, by implementing the right strategies, we believe that this can change. So over to you, Susie. I believe that we do have another poll question coming up,
We
right?
certainly do, Eric. So coming up on your screen now, please do tick all that apply. What are your key concerns regarding e-invoice compliance? Is it your ERP migration, the general change management that comes with an e-invoicing program, communication of that, getting momentum behind it? Is it consolidation of maybe consolidation of the local e-invoicing networks that you're currently using, how to manage them? Is it the knowledge gaps that you're concerned may exist regarding, of course, all the upcoming requirements, but wider e-invoicing stroke compliance issues out there, or maybe something else? So what are your key concerns regarding e-invoice compliance today? Closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Let's have a look at the results. Clear winner, 75% of you saying the knowledge gaps, and then the others kind of in equal second place. Interesting. Back to you, please, Eric and Brad.
Perfect. Thank you, Susie. I agree. This is very interesting because we do see a lot of the same things in our day-to-day, conversations with our clients. So as we take a look back at the agenda, we have hopefully helped define what the problem is. And so next, what we want to do is we want to walk through the 8 essentials that you, as hopefully a U.S. multinational, agree that you must know. These are 8 essentials that we're going to walk through, from 8 down to 1, hopefully building upon one another and helping you better understand what is the foundation of these 8 essentials, and carrying our way all the way down, our way all the way down to the culmination of what maybe you can be doing next. And ultimately, as we talk about these 8 essentials, why is this important for you to understand as a U.S. multinational? So buckle up. Let's go for a little bit of a ride, and we'll walk through these 8 essential points that we feel you must know as a U.S. multinational. And as I mentioned, building the foundation, the number one thing that we feel like you should do is starting with number 8 and counting down, but find an owner. You need somebody within your organization that is going to own the strategy for e-invoice compliance. And that is incredibly important to make sure that there is a single individual, or possibly even as you look at this and listen to what I'm about to say, you're going to hear the emergence of what ultimately becomes a center of excellence. So within the ownership of the e-invoice compliance solution, and this is a living, breathing situation, and that it doesn't stop. As you saw, ongoing, it continues to grow. That individual or that team can help prioritize what are the projects that you need to put into place. These are somebody that can gather that information, right? You've all indicated you have knowledge gaps, and oftentimes because that knowledge is in different parts of the organization. So once you have an owner of this solution, of this project, this ongoing project, that individual can start to gather the information into a consolidated area and really start to collect that information. And really, as you select that vendor, some of you had global vendors, some of you had multiple vendors around the world, but with that owner, you can start to have a single point of contact for hopefully what will become a global vendor for you to address and help support you with your global initiative to address the growing problem of e-invoice compliance, and then ultimately have that strategic oversight. A lot of what we're talking about and what comes to mind is, what are the new regulations that are coming up, right? What are the new things that countries are trying to do? But within that, you also have your own business initiatives. Are you as an organization hoping to enter into a new market? Are you wanting to go into Poland and all of a sudden you find out that there is an e-invoice compliance requirement in Poland that you have to adhere to? So have an owner that can ultimately build all of this as a foundation for everything that we're going to start to walk through from 8 down to 1 as we go through the 8 essentials. So that is number 8, find an owner. Going on to number 7, what that owner and that center of excellence really needs to understand are what are the different models out there. I talked earlier about low impact countries and high impact countries and regions. And as we talk about e-invoicing, it can actually conjure up different thoughts and images depending on where you are in the world. And again, as US multinationals, we may not be aware of all of the different intricacies that occur within the different models around the globe for e-invoicing. And you'll actually start to see, I'm going to throw a curveball at you, you might start to see a different terminology, and that is continuous transaction controls, because it's not always about e-invoicing. There are different functions, different models that can occur. So walking through these, looking at interoperability. This is kind of the B2G market, PEPL across Europe, where there is not really a government that's in the middle, but there is an infrastructure that has been defined with a governance over that infrastructure and the formats that are utilized for the exchange of data on that invoice from the supplier to buyer. And oftentimes the supplier and the buyer needs to have a service provider that can send and accept those invoices. And if we pay very close attention to the arrows here, you can see what's happening with the process flow, with the life of that invoice and the acceptance or rejection that is occurring. Interoperability is something that, again, is really that we see a lot within that B2G market. And again, as a US multinational, as an American, I typically think about B2G as literally what it says, government. But it actually is not always just transitioning or invoicing a government. It is actually invoicing the public sector. That could be healthcare, that could be universities, that could be education, that could be a whole host of industries that you might be doing business with. And so therefore you need to be aware of what the interoperability function is in different markets. Moving on to maybe where we're going to enter into the realm of what you're more aware of when we talk about electronic invoicing is the centralized invoicing model. And I'm going to try to walk through the next few fairly quickly and focus on the arrows, right? Within centralized invoicing, the government has literally inserted themselves in the middle of the process. So therefore, as a supplier, all you really need to do is register your invoice with the government. I think of this like a PO box. As a buyer, you need to understand how to go and collect that invoice. Think about what I mentioned about Karen earlier, breaking that process. Karen's no longer receiving invoices directly from her supplier in these markets. Now she's got to figure out, what is the digital key? How do I access the government platform? And how do I pick up that invoice as a buyer? And what do I do after that? Now, probably one of the most prominent examples of e-invoicing is the clearance market. This is dominant in Latin America, but we're also seeing clearance emerge in different areas of the world as well. And in this case, by comparison, really even contrast to centralized invoicing, it's very similar in that a supplier needs to register the invoice with the government for an acceptance or rejection. That supplier then is responsible for the distribution to the buyer. So whether you're a supplier that has to figure out what are my obligations, well, now that I've got an acceptance or a rejection, I have to bring all of that data that I've received from the government, make sure that gets on the invoice so that I can now send to my buyer. And again, breaks that process. As a buyer, you now need to recognize, okay, I'm in a market in which I'm going to be receiving this invoice, a structured invoice, right, directly from that supplier. And I need to understand what to do with it. Am I going to manage it through the PDF that I'm receiving? Am I going to manage it through the structured file? So ultimately within this clearance model, you really need to figure out what are the best scenarios and best cases that you can use to drive automation and standardization in those markets. And then there's real-time reporting. Really in real-time reporting, a lot of times this has been on the supplier, but we've actually seen, especially in Italy and cross-border, a real-time reporting function come up for AP. And so as you look at these different models, it's important to understand what is the process. In real-time reporting, the invoice in this case has actually already been sent to the buyer. So then after that fact, you need to create what is called a report, effectively, of that invoice and send it up into the government. So that is number 7, understanding those different models. So as an owner, or hopefully having an owner in your organization, one of the first things that they can do, again, building on this 8 down to 1, start to understand what are the different models that are out there in the marketplace. So let's move on to number 6 now. And number 6, Some of this is pretty obvious. Some of you probably have even joined this webinar because of what you see on the right-hand side. You've heard about compliance. You know that compliance exists, and you know there's big problems with what happens in these markets if you're not compliant. That could be penalties. That could be shutdown of your business. It may be that you're not getting the invoice into your customer's hands so that you're not getting paid. That's kind of high level. Moving over to the left, the compliance challenges that you as an organization see across different departments, both within the business and the IT teams, are a lot of what you guys have already addressed in the poll. That is gathering and understanding what is the information that's available to me and how do I apply that based upon my business. So within that, you might look out for a suitable solution provider. As I noticed in one of the earlier polls, a lot of times you go locally for that, take that local knowledge, but that ultimately by country then means you're dealing with multiple vendors. And so some of the other challenges are, how do you connect to the government? Thinking back to the earlier slide, right? Do I have to connect to the SDI in Italy, or am I in a market in which the buyer or the seller is going to send me the invoice directly? Ensuring you fulfill those local content requirements and staying compliant. We mentioned change management earlier, and I saw a few of you had actually listed change management as one of your biggest challenges. So now that we have an owner, now that we understand the different models, and we start to collect what are the challenges, right? We talked about the problem earlier on, so applying all of that knowledge to understand what are the challenges within your organization, you must know that so that you can effectively address that within your organization. So looking at number 5, what does this mean? I touched on it a little bit earlier. We have an owner, we know the models, we now understand the challenges. What is the cost? What happens if I don't do this? There always is going to be teeth, as I often say, for compliance. And the cost of non-compliance can be extremely high. And it varies by market. So again, going back to that knowledge gap, how do you understand what it is that could possibly happen? Well, in Latin America, you could be fined upwards of 300 to even 4,000 US dollars if you have an incorrect or missing invoice. Looking in Saudi Arabia, if you have not issued an invoice or have not archived it properly, you could get anything from a warning the first time to receiving a fine in Saudi Arabia as well. And then across Europe, I've had several conversations with customers in which it is widely known that there's about an 1,800 euro fine per invoice if it is not received in, say, Hungary, for example, in time. Do you know what Hungary's timeline is in their legislation? Immediately. What is your first question? What does that even mean, right? So ensuring that you know what these things are, ensuring that you're working with the right partner, and you have all of this in place so that you can address these things, you can start to show your organization that you've mitigated these risks. So that is kind of 8 through 5. I think you've heard enough from me. I'm going to turn it over to Eric to take this home from 4 down to 1.
Thank you, Brad. All good points for sure. So let's keep working down the list with the point number 4. We have been talking about the challenges. We have been talking about a world of differences, right? And what top companies are trying to do, right, is to finding ways to standardize in that world of differences. So standardization is absolute key. And you want to be able to set up a common and standardized process in the way you're receiving data and in the way you're sending data, regardless of where you are in the world, whether it's through a post-audit model, whether it's through centralized exchange, clearance, PEPL, interoperability, or real-time reporting. It shouldn't really matter. And to achieve this, I think it's important to asking the right questions to the partner that you want to work with, such as, how does the format conversion, how is that being done, and how can that allow for scalability, moving from one country to the next, or are we looking to for a re-implementation for every new country? So I think standardization and scalability kind of goes hand in hand here. And also touching on the archiving requirements and how is that supported? Not only the retention period, but also how the document is being stored. Is it stored according to the local legislation within the various markets? And also what types of validation checks are being done? How can we catching errors early on, so that we can act on it in a timely manner, right? And what data can be enriched should our system not be ready to export or consume certain data elements that may be required. So all of these things are important in order to kind of achieve that standardized process, if you will, both on the AP side and the AR side. Moving along here with number 3, win internal support. So going from top to bottom here, plan ahead and allocate resources, because this will require resources on your end, especially in the beginning. Designing the solution right from start is key. That is really going to help you to scale going into the future. Stay informed. There's tons of information out there, and as Brad mentioned earlier, there's a tsunami right now of new requirements, changes to existing requirements, etc. And really finding a partner that can help you to consume this information, support you with this information as it pertains to your business and your unique business scenarios. And I'm going back to the poll question. I think 75% answered lack of information, and that is something that we truly see in the market because there are so much information out there. And then one of the most important things I would say is to think scale. I've already talked about this, and the e-invoicing and regulatory requirements are here to stay. Scalability should be one of the most important requirements as you select your partner. How do we move from one country to the next, as well as how do we increase volume as new mandates are being introduced. Also preparing for other document types, I think that's important. Today, the main focus has been on the invoices, right? Mainly because that's where the mandates are today. But that may not be the case in the future. We're already seeing countries and industries starting to mandate the full orders to cash and the full purchase to pay process, including other documents like orders and order acknowledgements, etc. A good example of that is the NHA and NHS in the UK. And last one, we have change management. Unfortunately, this isn't just you set it up once and then it's done. The mandates are constantly changing, and this is something that you need to be aware of and plan for together with the service provider that you are choosing to work with. All right, so let's move on to number 2, cross-functional collaboration and alignment. So within your organization, you will have different goals, different objectives, different KPIs. I mean, IT, for example, IT wants to standardize as much as possible. Compliance wants to avoid penalties and risk, right? And finance wants to improve cash flow, decrease DSO and DPO. So making sure to include all of these different goals and objectives as you're selecting your service provider, and keep following up on the progress. It is easy to get into kind of a firefighting mode, if you will, to avoid penalties, and you're kind of losing sight of the other goals that you have put into place. So almost going back to having that, owner, that ownership, someone that is having that clear oversight, as Brad discussed. All right, so moving over to number 1, and we want to introduce the network, right? The compliant network. I hear from almost all my clients that I am not in the business of compliance, nor do I want to be. I am in the business of selling laptops, for example. So I don't want to have to deal with all these compliance issues that I'm seeing. So imagine a world where you can connect your system once to that single network of your choice. And by doing that, you are connected to all the relevant government infrastructures out there, regardless of where they are in the world. You're connected to the main industry infrastructures, whether that is healthcare or oil and gas or what have you, right? And you don't have to think about what other service providers that your trading partners, whether it's customers or vendors, are using, because they are connected. Almost like the telco industry. I use T-Mobile. Brad, he may be using AT&T. We can still text and call each other as much as we want. And that is what we're working towards in this industry as well. So kind of the four main points here, what you should be looking at when evaluating a service provider or a network is digital, of course, global, open, and smart. So sum this up, Brad. Go ahead.
Perfect. And I see we're getting a little bit long here, so I'm going to try and get through this pretty quickly, right? So the network approach hopefully is becoming very obvious. When you take a network approach, you start to build one integration, one connection into a network that can help you reach everything beyond. By contrast, the point-to-point approach does mean a lot of integrations. It means that you have to support and maintain those. You have different formats in that point-to-point, whereas when you get a network approach, you want to standardize as much as possible. Get as few formats as you possibly can that are coming out of your system, standardize on them that can all be converted into what each individual government needs. And so what all that does is it means that you can create a scalable solution, you can create a solution that is flexible, and what that helps you do is mitigate cost, right? Mitigate risk, as we've talked about. Reduce all of that maintenance that occurs when you have that point-to-point connection. So this network approach we have seen in the marketplace really help accelerate an organization, a US multinational's ability to address what we've talked about as the problem. So what we've done here at Pagero is to help differentiate ourselves. We've helped support the 100% digitization of the documents from day one. We help you consolidate. We help you ensure that you're compliant, and we help ensure that your data quality is as good as it could possibly get. It comes down to data, right? We live in the world of data, so we need to make sure that as potentially partners or you utilizing a network, that you find one that can help you do all of these things. Be sure that you can address your digital needs, consolidate and standardize, and make sure that you're meeting the compliance needs as well as the data quality. So as we take a look at the agenda and try and help wrap this up, what we've done is we've defined the problem. We walked through the 8 essentials that you as US multinationals must know to address that problem. Everything from 8 at ownership, building upon that into knowledge and understanding what is the cost of non-compliance, how to address it through standardization and hopefully a network type of approach. So now what do you do? All that's great, but what are my first next steps? What could you start doing today? So let's walk through what the practical next steps can be. Number 1, understand the infrastructures that you already are connected to or which ones you may need to connect to. With that ownership, hopefully that you're starting to think about within the organization, maybe it's you, start to own that. Who in my organization can tell me what are the infrastructures and what document formats are being used? You might have to jump over to IT for this. Understand from the IT team, how many different formats are we building to address the different needs within the marketplace, right? And then as Eric mentioned, what are the document types? Is it just invoicing? Do we need to address orders or anything else there beyond? What do we see coming up in the future? Is my partner able to help me with these things? So as we think about these practical next steps, start walking down. Number 1, mandatory infrastructures you're connected to. Number 2, what are the document formats you're utilizing? Number 3, document types that you might need to account for. And number 4, what are the document content requirements? Do you know what those are? Moving over onto the other side, starting with 5 and working our way down again. A lot of people do understand that there is an archiving component, but they don't always understand what that means. Again, as US multinationals, maybe we don't have a view into that world of needing to preserve and archive documents for a specified period of time per local legislation. So start to understand what that means for your organization and how are you expected to exchange the documents with the other parties. Think about the different models, think about what your customer requirements are. Number 7, what are the mandatory infrastructure messages? Are you receiving responses back, right? You're sending things out the door using Eric's kind of visual of the phone. My phone cuts out every once in a while and all of a sudden I got to figure out how to get reconnected, right? So what are these message types that are coming back to me that I need to understand how to address? How am I collecting the data that the government's giving me from an acceptance or rejection? And then number 8, what is your buyer acceptance or rejection? We've talked a lot about the government, but that doesn't mean we can just forget what your buyers need. So understanding from 1 all the way down to 8, these are the next steps that you could do. Start to gather this information, reduce that knowledge gap within your organization, utilizing the 8 essentials, and start to address exactly what you might need to be able to do from today moving forward. So with that, I do want to thank you very much for taking the time to listen in into this this session today. My name again is Brad Coley, and you also heard from Eric Mood, Managing Director. We strongly urge you to call us, reach out to us, let us know if you have any questions or anything that we can help address. And with that said, Susie, I believe we have one more poll question that hopefully touches right onto this topic.
We do indeed. So I'll open it up. Please go ahead and have a look at it and respond to all that apply as we move into questions. So if you haven't already submitted your question, please do so. And please take a moment just to participate in this final poll. Would you like to receive any of the following options after the webinar? Maybe a free consultation or a demo with the Pagero team? Would you like to sign up for the Pagero Compliance Monitor to help you on this journey? Or perhaps you'd like a link to the Pagero Compliance Map that will help you in the education of each of the jurisdictions and their requirements. Right, so as you do that, let's move into some Q&A. Number 1 question that's come through: what is the biggest mistake you would, in your opinion, that a company makes when implementing global e-invoicing?
Maybe I can take a first stab at this, Brad.
Yeah, go for it.
So, I mean, I would say it comes down to the scalability aspect, right? That we have one mandate that had come up and we need a solution for that yesterday, and we are only focusing on satisfy the need for that single mandate. And we're not thinking ahead. We're not building a solution that is scalable, that we can copy from one market to the next. So all of a sudden we are building these point-to-point solutions that is basically a re-implementation every single time, and that I would say is the number 1 biggest mistake that I see companies are doing. I don't know, Brad, if you want to expand on that based on your experience.
I think you really touched on it, that scalability is a big issue, but it also drives a little bit of what we talked about earlier, right? And the automation aspect of this and the ability to standardize and collect that data. So if you have point to point, number 1, it's a lot of vendor management, but also you've got to keep up with all of the change management and everything else that's going on. In my career, I've seen a number of companies that get caught up in trying to understand how to address a change in one country while also addressing a rollout in a new country of e-invoicing mandates, and ultimately that causes a lot of regression testing on the system. It bogs down the IT team to understand how to do that. So there are a lot of downstream effects when you don't really address that standardization and scalable aspect of a solution.
Okay, thank you. What would you say is the most common e-invoicing model out of the 4 that were represented in the webinar today?
I can go first on this one. I would say probably the one that comes to mind most for people is that clearance model, the one where a supplier has to register an invoice with the government, get all of the data back from the government in an acceptance or rejection, hopefully an acceptance, right? And then apply that data to the invoice that then needs to be sent over to the buyer. With that said, we are starting to see more and more of the centralized model coming into place. And the reason for that is because if we think about the VAT gaps, the data is collecting that invoice information and they're triangulating it, right? So they're getting it both from the AR and the AP side, and they effectively know exactly exactly what your tax position is. And then the onus is on you to report exactly what the government already knows. So that's why I would say those two models, really the clearance one is the one most thought of. We're seeing the centralized invoicing coming up, and actually some flavors of the real-time invoice reporting for things like the B2C market or other aspects like cross-border, as I mentioned. But to answer the question directly, the most prominent, I think, is that clearance model with a very close second of the centralized invoicing.
Who do you think is best placed to own this on a global basis within an organization?
That's a great question. So I don't know, Eric, if you want me to jump in on this. I've seen anywhere from somebody in IT to somebody in the business, or even a business liaison type of person. We see, controllers. We see launch managers, as they are called sometimes. So it's really somebody that understands what are the needs of both the business and IT, and within the business, some fingers in both tax and in finance is kind of my answer. So I'm not great at titles, but whatever that title is in your organization that has a little bit of perspective of what the IT pains are, right? As we talked about, the different formats, the different integrations, as well as what the tax team is trying to accomplish and what the finance team is trying to accomplish. And we're starting to see the emergence of titles of e-invoicing manager type of thing. Eric, I don't know if you have any additional input on that.
Yeah, or e-capability managers, etc. No, the only thing I would add is one thing that we see more recently is that this is driven from the collection department. Because a lot of large companies, they go out and they trying to understand how do we improve, our collection processes, how do we decrease DSO, and that's where it starts. And then they realize that the first and most important step in order to reduce DSO is to make sure that we get the invoice in the hands of our customers. So a lot of these projects more recently are being driven by the collection department, and they are kind of the they kind of start the whole initiative, and then it may not be owned by them, but I still think it's an interesting development that we're seeing.
Okay, good. Which are the markets? Which markets does Pagero operate in, please?
So we are operational. We have customers in about 140 plus countries today. We are fully compliant in 75 plus countries around the world, so quite many. Offices across 32 offices across Latin America, North America, Europe, APAC, and Africa as well.
Okay,
so yeah.
A very extensive footprint. If you haven't posted your question you want to, you've got a few more minutes to do so, and then we will be closing the webinar. Could you touch on e-reporting, for example, SAFT, and tell me a little bit more about how you approach that particular requirement?
I think that starts to dip into my area here, so I'll address it initially. Pagero really is on the transactional side of invoice compliance. And so SAFT, while it involves the individual invoices, it's really more of a fiscal report. So what we really advise is that as an organization, you look at the separation of the reporting on a SAFT or a fiscal type of basis from the transactional day-to-day operational needs. And so what we've tried to do, right, is from the day-to-day operational needs, we've tried to ensure that we work with different partners around the world that can satisfy SAFT while we satisfy the transactional. One of the things that I hear from so many of my clients is needing your system to be the source of truth. And when it comes to SAFT or different VAT reporting needs, it effectively is a report of everything that's happened on the day-to-day basis. So when you're looking for a provider, make sure that you find one that is ensuring that the data is in your system that was exactly as it was registered within the government. And then you mitigate the risk on that reporting function. So hopefully I'm addressing the question there, but when it comes to that reporting, that is something that we would advise, that there are different partners out there that could be utilized. What we really do is we want to make sure that there's a separation of that transactional from the reporting, but everything stems from the data within your system. It comes down to data. And that's why we help ensure that your system is the source of truth on the transactional. And therefore, when it comes to your SAFT requirements or other reporting requirements, the data is coming from that system in an accurate and efficient way. Eric, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you covered most of it, and just to emphasize on a few things there. We see a lot of U.S. multinationals going out to large global RFPs, including both electronic invoicing and VAT reporting into kind of the same bucket, if you will. And a lot of these RFPs, they tend to kind of fail, and nothing happens really, because these are two very separate vendors. The VAT reporting and the tax determination, that's one side, and then you have the transactional, that's another side. So we do see that that the separation of those two is it's important.
Okay, great. All right, good. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Eric, and the Pagero team. We're going to leave it there. So just to draw your attention, viewers, to some more upcoming webinars that we've got over the next month or so. So please do familiarise yourself with all of those and let your colleagues know about them if they're in a slightly different process area. And we look forward to welcoming you next time. Thank you so much for your attention today, and goodbye.